Welcome to Editor's Choice, Latin American Perspectives Book Conversations. My name is Alexander Scott. I'm the Outreach Coordinator for Latin American Perspectives and a member of the editorial collective.
I'm Tomas Crowder Taraborelli, a member of the editorial collective and co-editor of the media and film section.
For today's show, we have another music-themed episode for you, where we met with Bryce Henson to discuss his book, Emergent Quilombos, Black Life and Hip Hop in Brazil, published by University of Texas Press in 2023. Bryce Henson is an associate professor in the Department of Communication and Journalism with affiliations in Africana Studies and the Race and Ethnic Studies Institute at Texas A&M University, and an affiliated researcher with the Pós-Afro program at the Universidade Federal da Bahia in Brazil. He is also an associate editor for Transforming Anthropology and serves on the advisory board for the Association for the Study of the Worldwide African Diaspora.
So, congratulations on publishing your book, and thank you for taking the time to join us for this conversation exploring Brazilian hip-hop. Bryce, in the introduction to Emergent Quilombos, Black Life and Hip-Hop in Brazil, you cite hip-hop historian Jeff Chang, who famously said, "It's a hip-hop world." Do you think Chang was right in the case of Brazil having such a diverse music tradition?
Oh, absolutely. Right. And I think, turning to the mighty Jeff Chang is to recognize, for me, I think what I was invoking with him is to think about hip hop as not just global, but also intensely diasporic. And that, hip hop at its foundation was extremely diasporic. Of course, we all know we can trace it back to the Boogie Down Bronx, but it was also, not just forged by U.S. African Americans, but also Afro-Caribbean, Spanish Caribbean folks, many of whom are also African descended. And you can see the way that this communities, right, marginalized who are Black and Latine, many of which are Afro-Latine, right, combined different diasporic musical influences in hip hop, right? So with and I always like to tell my students, I say, do you know who the founder of hip hop is? Of course, referring to DJ Kool Herc, Jamaican, and, of course they don't know. And I just tell them like, you don't love hip hop. But so invoking Jeff Chang is also a way to talk about the diasporic networks that have continued to emerge from hip hop. So I think so often we think it's just a U.S. Black cultural form. And I think that can be further from the truth, right? And, to think about U.S. African American culture has already diasporic, hip hop is already diasporic. And so where does this diasporic sensibility take us? And why do people, particularly people around the African diaspora, find resonance with hip hop, right? And, of course, in Brazil, so many people only associate hip hop with the São Paulo and sometimes the Rio scene, right? Those are the urban industrial capitals. People find much more resonance with São Paulo to say New York, Rio would say Miami or Los Angeles. But, I also wanted to say, if we're going to think about it being global and even transnational, it's not just transnational because it's in one or two places in, say, Brazil, right? That it also circulates in many other places. And, I always like to tell people too, I'm also guilty of a certain tendency within, let's say, Brazilian studies or Black studies in Brazil. We always triangulate between São Paulo, Rio, and Salvador, right? Extremely important cities, but there's a lot more to, say, Black Brazilian culture outside of those places, and especially hip hop as well. There's thriving scenes all over, whether it's Belo Horizonte, Recife, Fortaleza, etc. So I think it's important when we think about a world that is not just, oh, there's hip hop in this nation over here, right? But what are the different kind of circuits and connections that these places have? So yeah, I would absolutely say it, hip hop, it's a hip hop world, but it's also very much a, I always like to invoke that it's diasporic connections too, that Black people in Brazil turn to hip hop when they have such a rich history, African derived cultures, whether that's samba or capoeira, of course, Afro-Brazilian religions like candomblé, right? Why is it that Black Brazilians are turning to hip hop, right? What kind of diasporic connections is that forging? What kind of messages is that saying about the commonality of the diaspora, as Tiffany Patterson and Robin D.G. Kelly would say, is a process and a condition, right? Taking that to Salvador da Bahia, which has often been romanticized as an Afro paradise, a place that because it is 80% Black, African descended, and you can see and feel the Black culture all over the city. There's not racism there, right? It's in some ways this racial paradise, right? The Black Mecca, the Black Rome, the capital of happiness. And so, part of my work there too was thinking about inserting Salvador da Bahia into this hip hop world, into these diasporic networks of hip hop to say, hey, we also are experiencing similar material conditions, whether those are valences that are social or economic or political, right? They're not just cultural. That we find resonance too with hip hop scene in Brazil, but also around the diaspora, particularly United States, right? So, it's definitely a hip hop world, but there's a hip hop diaspora.
So you've already started to answer this question, but I'd like to dive a little deeper. So a lot of your book specifically is looking at Bahia. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the specific hip hop scene there, as well as like what spaces for cultural expression you think like hip hop music offers folks in Brazil. And could you describe some of the work, some of the music, the outside of music work that folks are doing in terms of like the rising stars of the hip hop genre?
Yes. I think with the hip hop scene in Salvador, right, that a lot of people often think about I would say like touristy areas, right? So a lot of people, when they think about Afro-Brazilian culture, first and foremost, they think of Pelourinho, the historic center. They got Olodum, the Gigantes there. Of course, and he's a complicated figure, to say the least, and maybe that's being too generous, but Jorge Amado, the famed novelist from Bahia. And then, of course, you have, a lot of people, often when they think of Salvador, they think of Atlantic Ocean beachfront, so neighborhoods like Baja, Rio Vermelho, Pituba, etc. But they think about certain kind of middle class or even elite spaces that are often in the center. They don't often think about the Black spaces that are excluded, right? And so, kind of back to the basic question, and this is actually how I like to get people to understand how I got to hip hop, because when I set out to do this, I wasn't looking for hip hop. And there's actually some of my friends there, as an ethnographer, often we're lucky and then we're smart enough to know we're lucky. They're like, hey, we think you really should look at this hip hop scene. And what I was really looking at was, there's all these Afro-Brazilian cultures that are included into the city fabric, but you don't see that translate to social, economic, or political inclusion. For example, if you look at social and economic indices, right, Black people are overwhelmingly marginalized, right? Whether that's earning income, social segregation, even though there hasn't been even though it hasn't been codified, right? The system here works pretty well where Black Brazilians are very segregated. You also see this in health outcomes, educational outcomes, and then also for a city, like I said, that's 80% Black, has never elected a Black mayor, right? And so you see the way that there's a certain kind of cultural influence that Black people have, but this doesn't also translate to other segments in society. And so my question was, well, what are the Black cultures of Black people in Bahia? Ordinary folks, right? What we might call the popular classes. And so, that requires you to go to much different spaces and say Pelourinho or Pituba, Rio Vermelho. And so, this was very much how I got to hip hop, right? And in Salvador, what people would always tell me is that it's a militant movement, right? And so, for Latin Americans, we might pick up on what militant means, but really, in some ways, it might be better translated as activists, right? But this militancy, this commitment to social and economic and political change and justice. And they will also say that they're the most militant hip hop movement in Brazil, right? Now, I'm not there to tell them whether they're right or wrong, right? But this is something I heard over and over, right? And I think that's really a commitment it's part of their commitment. And one thing they always also told me too was, and this is, getting to that point about what's happening kind of outside of the cultural expressions, whether that's rap music, DJing, graffiti, or breakdancing, that they always distinguish themselves as a hip hop movement and not just a culture, right? And so the hip hop culture is in the movement, but the movement is mobilizing the fifth element of hip hop, which is information and knowledge. Right. And so there's, so many of them say we're not here just to make music and gather, but we're here to, on behalf of social justice and for a variety of causes. So many people are involved in the Black movement down here. Lots of folks are, they're part of various other social movements that are kind of working, side by side. And another thing I always like to tell people that hip hop here is not isolated. It's very much in connection to other cultural and political scenes, right? So, Carnival just happened a few weeks ago. And I saw a lot of people, in some of the Afro locals, like, Iliaye or Olodum, or, you might see them in Fiuji Ganji, right? These things are not neatly bounded as sometimes we like to think they are. And this also applies to the political movements they're a part of, right? Some people are very much in vegan movements, right? Or, some people want to be veterinarians and, advocate for, animals, right? Things like that. So you actually see them across a wide variety, different social movements in the city, very politically active. But a lot of it also comes to racial and class justice, right? I mean, there are white people in the hip hop movement, but really what it comes down to is a Black-based cultural political movement that's really thinking about ordinary folks, which is to say Black folks in marginalized communities, whether those are inside whether the periphery or hillside communities within the city. And so, they're very adamant about hip hop as what many people would say informal social work, right? So hip hop is not just a cultural expression, it's something you do and something you do on behalf of others. Even some of that's just community outreach, doing informal workshops, youth intervention, things of that nature. And so, a lot of people do this in different ways at different stages in their lives. You also see some folks who get older and, the things you can do in your 20s, you can't always do in your 30s and 40s, whether that's, a parent getting old or you have kids or, a career, things like that. And of course, those things often impact women a lot more than they do men. As far as some of the rising stars these days, I would say, there's sorry, it's blank. Well, there's Audio Semesaria, who is from Cajazeras, an amazing artist who had her single in 2017. She's a big name on the scene. I would say, there's a very prominent DJ named Nike who was only in her early 20s, and she's been doing this for 10 years, but just a really beloved DJ who's very prominent. And then the other person, it is Javi Lobo. There it is, Javi Lobo, who's been called the Shakespeare of the ghetto. And so, there's some really fantastic folks here who are doing that. And I also like to give a shout out to some of the older folks as well, right? Leandro Vitorola has been doing work
Kind
for
of
a
the
long.
pioneers,
Yeah, in hip hop, you always gotta, pay respects to the elders, right? DJ Branco, Skoskaki, Alvaro Heu, Cynthia Salvoli, Sister Caccio, folks like this, right? It's a scene that actually goes back to the 80s, which a lot of people wouldn't know because some people think it's a more recent thing. But I would say, especially with the rise of the internet, it's been able to spread much more than it has to historically. But, the scene here goes back 40 years.
Dos quilombos de peixinho, macaco, cabula e brotas, os tambores anunciam o exército que não usa botas. Com fome de justiça articulando a insurreição, marchemos irmãos, sedentos por libertação. Uma força misteriosa que emerge do submundo, com microfone em punho, destruindo sentimentos imundos de pé descalço. Consegui, comigo fugir. A caminho do meu refúgio, o quilombo vivo. Meu sangue urubá corre nas veias, com certeza. Foi eu quem jogou o feitor pra cima quando subi a ladeira, as minhas mãos ensanguentadas. Cheia de calos, quantas vezes o couro do meu pé nas pedras ficou grudado. Eu pisava em carne viva, ai como ardia. E você ainda acredita que isso era preguiça? Mas não me entreguei, não vou voltar pro tronco. Não vou morrer de banzo, não vou morrer de banzo. Vem comigo cruzar o Atlântico, retorno à África, reencontrar suas origens, se livrar da dor. Construindo a nova história, segue a diaspora. Novos griots, negra magia de Salvador, Moaxó, Auon, Ojuorum, arquétipo, domínio do ferro, abrindo meus caminhos na selva ou no deserto. O corte da minha espada das correntes te livrará. Ogum Atupuê, Amor Pulo, Ileuá. Só nego fugido, só nego fugido, só nego fugido, indo pra o quilombo vivo. Só nego fugido, só nego fugido. Não pagamos alforria! Só nego fugido, só nego fugido, só nego fugido, indo pra o quilombo vivo. Só nego fugido, só nego fugido. Não pagamos alforria!
Tanto menores como de adultos que desapareceram de repente sem deixar o mínimo vestígio para salvar.
In your book, you analyze the history of quilombos in northern Brazil. Can you share with our listeners some of the key events in that history and explain its social, cultural, economic importance for Black people in Brazil?
Oh, yes. So the Quilombo is what we might call a maroon in English. Also goes by Palenque, Cimarron, some other couple terms, but those are kind of the main ones. So in Brazil, when Africans arrived here as part of the transatlantic slave trade, and I also always like to take these, and I know we have a predominant Latin American ist audience, but I always like to say as many times as I can that I think we need to acknowledge Portugal's role in the transatlantic slave trade. They get very quiet. You know, when England and Spain and France takes all the heat, they just quiet. It's like that Homer Simpson meme where they, blend into the bushes. So when Africans first came as chattel property, right? This is really important, right? Black people did not accept their slavery as a condition in the way of life. And I take this term actually from Cedric Robinson and Black Marxism, right? But Black people refused it, escaped their places of racial confinement, fled into the abyss. And really, I use abyss in kind of this idea of the unknown. I always think about how remarkable it is to be taken across an ocean and to be put into a foreign land and to be inserted in that kind of economy and be like, hell no, right? But you also don't know what the alternative is, right? But it has to be better than this, right? And so when I say the abyss was that unknown, right? And then to go into often hard to reach hillside areas and reestablish what they can, an African-oriented society, right? And this is not to say they made a replica, right? But took the different cosmologies, ontologies, practices, rituals, religions, ways of life, and did what they could to recreate it on this side of the ocean. This happened almost as soon as Black people got to Brazil. And I always like to mention as well that, United States, we always mention 1619 in Brazil. They roughly say around 1511, between 1511 to 1530, if I remember correctly. I'm not a historian, but I do my best to be, historically informed, as all my mentors, are very proud of me for. And so, in the history of quilombos in Brazil, everyone always turns to Palmares, which of course is extremely important, which existed from 1605 to 1694. Some people think it might have started a little bit earlier, but more or less it lasted for almost a century. It's what's in present-day Alagoas, and it was led by three people. There was Akotune, and then Zumba Ganja, and then Zumbi. And people often think about Zumbi, but he was the last leader of Palmares, right? And this had best estimates about between 10 to 20,000 people who were taken, fugitives from slavery, who wanted to create an African society. One might even call it an African state. And it's important to note too that Palmares actually negotiated treaties with Pernambuco, or what's it, Pernambuco? I think it was Pernambuco at the time, Pernambuco governors, right? And so it operated with a certain kind of sovereignty. But of course, a quilombo was always seen as a threat by the Portuguese crown, by imperial and colonial forces. So they were constantly under attack. The 10 biggest quilombos in Brazil, 8 were destroyed within 2 years, right? And if you think about it, there's certain paradoxes that a quilombo brings to mind, right? Now, and I think about Beatriz Nascimento, who says that a quilombo exposes the breaches in the slavocratic system, in the slavocratic structure, right? And so when Black people fled the plantation, right, and ran to get their freedom, that right there is a crime in pursuing their freedom, because what they're doing is they're stealing property, which is to say they're taking back their bodies, right? Doing that, you're taking away the exploited labor on the plantation or wherever these spaces of racial confinement are. And you're also undermining the racial hierarchy that naturalizes the dehumanization of Black people so that they can be enslaved, right? So this was a huge threat, right? The Portuguese crown or colonial officials said that this was, quilombos were an enemy inside our borders, right? It was an internal enemy. And so, of course, quilombos were always under attack. But beyond Palmares, again, which is extremely important, we can't, the symbolic power of Palmares is hugely important, right? But there were also other quilombos that took on different formations, sizes, that lasted for different moments, right? And these were all practices of Black people fighting and pursuing freedom on their terms, and to assert human dignity, and to have certain relationships that were impermissible under Brazilian society, right? Under Brazilian colonialism and slavery. And I think this is extremely powerful because also, they weren't waiting on the charity of white abolitionists to grant them freedom, right? I mean, in Brazil, they say, abolition Brazil was the last nation to pass abolition in 1888. And again, I know many people know this, but I always like to, keep the message on brand. But a lot of people here say that they only signed abolition because Black people still haven't gotten their freedom. Even 100 years when they did the centennial celebration in 1988, right? This was a big discourse. So this is the kind of historical significance of quilombos, right? Now, I would also like to mention that a key facet of quilombos, we have to remember this actually comes from the Mbangala, right, in the Angola region on the other side, right? So you can actually trace a certain African inheritance, right? That this comes from a nomadic warrior society that grew by absorbing outsiders because they didn't raise children. They had certain Bantu philosophies about life and death, about the ancestors, about a supreme creator who then left the administration to their children, and what we would call orishas. And so you can see those connections, right? And so you see this, and so the Quilombo is, let me see here, I believe it's an Ombindu word, but it's just firmly an Imangala institution, right? And that was trans-ethnic and trans-culture, right? That was built upon the absorption of outsiders, right? You see this very same practice with Quilombos in Brazil, right? It wasn't ethnically specific, and I think sometimes we need to remind ourselves that the Africans who were brought to the Americas came from very different ethnic groups, and that the interactions and community formations they built were intercultural, trans-ethnic, and transcultural. And so I say that to say, bringing up the formation of the Quilombo in Angola, right, among the Bantu, right, there's a certain continuity, but there's also a certain evolution, right? It's a diachronic institution. And so, in the book, I heavily engage with Beatriz Nascimento, who was a Black feminist, Black Brazilian feminist who unfortunately died in 1994. It's a very sad story. I won't tell it here, but she did remarkable work on Quilombo communities, which now really kind of means rural Black communities, many of which founded by these Quilombo communities during the colonial era, and they've often been they've been struggling for land rights, and that's almost a different and a very important subfield of Quilombos right now. In some ways, it's really the dominant thread. And so I always like to stress when we talk about Quilombo, we invoke Beatriz Nascimento or even Alex Hatz or Agias Nascimento, that there's, we can't forget about the remnant communities in rural areas. But Beatriz Nascimento was doing work in these rural communities and tracing it back to Angola, right? But she was also finding a continuity into the present, right? And she was noting that, the Quilombo is not just a historical fact that's neatly bounded off from the present, that it has certain characteristics, that it has certain actions and certain philosophies. And, what she ends up saying is that, fundamentally, a Quilombo is a social condition of marginalized Black people who aren't accepted in Brazilian society, right? Who refuse the roles that are prescribed for them. And also marginalized Black people whose cultures aren't accepted either, right? And then they come together to provide, refuge and protection and community. And that you can see this and she's writing in the 80s in areas like favelas, right? Urban hillside communities. She lived predominantly in Rio, right? But she's talking about, in Rio, but we might say the periphery in São Paulo or, comunidades here in Salvador. She says you also see these in the Bailes Black, right? Which were Black youth in the periphery or comunidades getting together and playing soul music or funk, right? These are very intensely diasporic space, but they're also heavily persecuted too. She said you see this in Terreiro, which is a Afro-Brazilian religious complex. You'll see this in samba schools, right? So she's drawing a continuity between Black cultural expressions and Black communities and Black spaces that are marginalized in contemporary Brazilian society, right? She says you can find this same structural relationship in Brazilian colonial slavery, right? And so the way that, and what I would add, right, and this is, also drawn with the works, her, Alex Hatz, Muniz Sodré, Kristen Smith, Osmundo Pino, right, is that the structures of slavery and colonialism and white supremacy have also evolved, right? And so Black people's response to that is still going to create a Quilombo, right? And so in that regard, the Quilombo itself also has to change. It's not going to look the same, right? And again, if we think about that trans-ethnic and transcultural maybe not essence, right, but element to it that you can trace back to Angola, right? It was always evolving, right? And so often when we think about, for the non-historians, when we think about, pre-modern Africa, right, we think things are very static and there's these huge big breaks that all of a sudden change everything. But as we know, they're very small and incremental, and things on the ground often tell a different story, right? So these quilombos, right, you have the quilombo in Africa, you have it being retooled in colonial Brazil under slavery, and you have people who are still forming today. And of course, with the remnant communities, but also particularly in urban cities like Salvador, like Rio, and like São Paulo.
O que é a civilização africana e americana? É um grande transatlântico. Ela não é a civilização atlântica. Ela é transatlântica. Foi transportada para a América um tipo de vida que era africana. A transmigração de uma cultura e de uma atitude no mundo de um continente para o outro. De África para a América.
De África llegaron a nuestro continente centenares, millares de pueblos distintos, de culturas diferentes. Pero América, es cierto, ha unificado estas familias, ha unificado estas naciones, al darnos a todos nosotros un solo destino en torno a la lucha común de la liberación de nuestra raza.
That was a really excellent response. There's so many places I want to take this, but I really appreciate you grounding your response in the radical Black Brazilian tradition, which I think often gets overlooked in radical left-wing circles, especially those in the global north or the United States. We've actually, for a few years, been desperately trying to organize a podcast with Kristen Smith and Nascimento's daughter about their book. I forget the title of their book.
Dialectic in the Sea, no?
Yeah, Dialectic in the Sea. So this is just a reminder that we got to get that done, Tomas. Building off this idea of the quilombo and the need for change, I'm fascinated by this idea of hip hop as this new, like a new form of quilombo, and with that, in your book you identify three general, I guess you could call them tropes or stereotypes of Blackness within Brazil. I think the way you coined it was the abject, the folkloric, and the mixed, right? And I'd just be curious to hear you speak to the how hip hop functions as a quilombo, as a new form of quilombismo or what have you, and how it pushes back against these traditional or problematic ways of thinking about Blackness in Brazil.
Yeah. And also let me, if we're going to talk about a Black Brazilian radical tradition, we also need to invoke Clovis Moura, phenomenal work in the 20th century. I think most of his work was done in the 70s and 80s, or his books at least, but also just super important to, what we might call identifying a Black radical tradition and also a Black radical tradition of writing about this, right? With the way I kind of differentiate Blackness, I remember, can't remember what I cited somewhere in the book, right? But someone talks about, and this is also my training in British cultural studies, is that we have to think about Blackness as a sliding signifier, right? It can come to mean many things, right? And you can't ever close the meaning around what something comes to symbolize, right? And if you come to a place like Brazil, Blackness means so many different things, right? And so even I had, for many years, particularly at the dissertation stage, but even beyond, where I'm like, how do I navigate this, right? And so actually what helped me was I was blessed by a very generous advisor, Cameron McCarthy, who has this concept called non-synchrony, right? And actually being really useful. And, like all good advisors, the Cameron's like, I really think you should read this piece I wrote back in the day. And you're like, okay. And then you're like, oh, now I know what. Now I put the dots together. And, what he pointed out was, so often, people do this kind of additive thing. Like when we talk about class, we got to talk about race. And we talk about race, we got to talk about gender. Talk about gender, we got to talk about sexuality, right? And it's always this kind of additive. And sometimes intersectionality becomes that too. Not the people who coined it, right? And the kind of the people who are well grounded in it, but the way it becomes kind of this checklist of like, well, I'm this and this and this and this, right? And what non-synchrony does is show how that these different articulations can also point out to divergent politics, desires, and interests, right? For example, the Black middle class in suburbs might have different interests, and actually they might have interests that are in opposition to poor and working class Black communities in the city, of which that suburb is a ring, right? And so we have to think about the way that Blackness gets mobilized in different ways. That's all I had to say. That was a useful framework for kind of navigating the different ways that Blackness works in Brazil. And so what I really tried to think about was the different kinds of way that Blackness as a discourse, right, mobilizes, and also the way it gets attached to certain kinds of Black people, right? And so I really just kind of started off thinking with, going back to Brazilian colonialism and slavery, right? Blackness as abject, right? And this justifies the subhuman treatment of Black people on the plantation, through a variety of mechanisms, right? And that, if we go to, and let's also not forget, like many places in Latin America, right? The whitening thesis of Blackness is something we have to get rid of, right? Particularly post-abolition, right? The Black people are not seen as being equipped laborers, workers in a modern economy on the factories and industries, right? And of course, there's a whole sociological literature on why that it's, long been critiqued. And then enters Gilberto Freire, which, we all have to read. And he does, the racial democracy trope, and I won't repeat it here, right? But, really what's being valorized as a mixed kind of Blackness, right? A Blackness is not too Black, but we'll pick certain kind of pieces of what Blackness we like, whether that's cultural, embodied, right? And of course, people always point quickly to, kind of the first example is the hypersexual mulatta, right? Who is the product of harmonious, and I'm saying that very sarcastically. Let me even put my air quotes, relations between the white master and the African woman on the plantation, and, as much as it's critiqued and as trash as that book is, right? It still has staying power in national ideologies. And even people will, Lula, I think a year or two ago said, right, slavery was horrible, but it gave us something great. It gave us this interracial mixture, right? So it's really the staying power in that, right? And then fast forward to, let's say, the 70s, you have the re-Africanization of Bahia, but this is also happening with the funk movements and the soul parties and Rio and São Paulo, right? There's this valorization, and Black is beautiful. I always love when Black people here say Black power, it's Blackie power, or the way that they'll call other Black people Brau, right? Like James Brown. But particularly in Salvador, right, there was this, and I will say, like in that moment, right, if we're going to use what British cultural studies scholars would say as a conjunctural analysis, if you look at the 70s, that was a very powerful intervention, right? To say Black is beautiful. We're going to embrace natural hairstyles. We're going to, instead of eschewing or being ashamed of, we're going to embrace our African heritage and our cultural norms. We're going to embrace Black love, even though that's often very heteronormative. And, of course, we can, talk about that as well. And then also a lot of people who've been practicing African-derived religions, such as Candomblé or Umbanda, right, and it's still very much persecuted today, but felt more at ease celebrating it or practicing it or having the markers of that in public, right? And of course, in Salvador, the Baianas, Yacaré have always been present, and people know what that means and where it comes from, right? But there was a certain, racial pride in that, right? This cultural valorization, and I can't emphasize how important that was, but any good hegemonic apparatus is going to find a way to undercut, right, the political currency of any kind of cultural movement, right? And of course, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about Michael Hanchard's amazing book, Orifice and Power from 1994, right? That just because something was powerful at one point and made a necessary intervention doesn't mean the political apparatus can't rework that and form new relations and bonds to undermine that, right? How can we find a way to make this more palpable and non-threatening, right? And so I would say in the 70s, while arguing the book, right, is that you can see how, the re-Africanization movement in Salvador was really kind of taking this notion of abject Blackness, right, and trying to valorize it. But then you kind of have, this way that Blackness can be valorized if it's African, right, if it's very kind of normative, if kind of, if it tries to mirror Western civilization. But this also doesn't do away with racism, right? Black people are still, again, socially, economically, and politically marginalized. And so this is where, I kind of insert hip hop into there, right? It's in many ways picking up a baton, right? Of valorizing Black people who are associated with the abject Blackness and valorizing that and trying to create community around that in ways that resist being found palpable to the state, right? Or to certain kind of white bourgeois norms, right? And I also say in this book too, and I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself, the ethnographic research is in itself a conjunctural analysis. This could change in 5, 10, 20 years, right? And I say that to say, I love hip hop. I grew up with hip hop. It's been extremely important to me. I love the research I've done. The community here has been extremely important to me. Honestly, the generosity of these folks is just, bar none. But hip hop could also have a certain, and sometimes we see this, and I think about the 2016 Summer Olympics opening ceremony, right? You had, I believe, MECD was there, but they gestured towards hip hop, right, into rap music, right? And so there's a way that, this kind of folkloric Blackness of return to one's roots can also, the way they was undermined, this can also happen to hip hop, right? I hope not, right? And I think hip hop always has a commitment to, to the lived experiences and realities and material conditions of ordinary Black folks. But that's not guaranteed, right? I mean, we see in the United States, so many people just want to talk about, we see how the recording industry has gotten involved in that, how this can be marketed to maximize viewers and to, appeal to a 13-year-old middle school white kid in the suburbs, right? And now look where we're at right now. So these things are not, these things aren't always a given, and they don't always, just like history is dynamic, these movements are dynamic, right? And so, even though, I'm doing very much an ethnographic, anthropological study, right? Historically, I'm keeping in mind this there's no guarantee it's going to always stay like this.
In your book, you write, my own approach to understanding emergent quilombos, such as Bahian hip-hop, is guided by a Black, diasporic, feminist approach. What aspects of this approach have you found particularly effective when researching hip-hop?
Yes, so, I kind of come from a very simple premise. As a Black man, if we got to talk, if I'm going to make people talk about more than just class, we're going to also talk about race, then it's not too far of a bridge to cross to say, well, we need to talk about gender and sexuality too, right? And also religion. I think religion here is actually really important to what we might call an intersectional approach. And, as much as I love hip hop, right, personally and scholastically, it does have its own blind spots. And one thing that was really easy to pick up here was how the hip hop community creates its own margins, right? So as much as, hip hop is supposed to be a culture on the margins, right, is not without its own critique and creating its own margins. And so, very early on, I knew I wanted to make sure that I included women's voices, Black women's voices in the book. And that also required me to think about the gender dynamics, Blackness in Salvador, but, of course, keeping this within a diasporic framework because, I focus on Black Brazilian feminists, but I also draw on folks from the United States and the Caribbean, et cetera. And part of that was thinking about, I think one of the questions I always come back to is, for as much as, well, let me actually enter here. That when we talk about Black feminists, it's not just actually about Black women, right? That it's also useful for Black men, for other folks as well, right? And I think about, it's a way to think about how we're structured in relation to systems of oppression, right? And also thinking about the way that how do Black men also contribute to Black women's oppression, right? And how can we be better conspiracists to uproot or to upend a system that's meant to oppress us all, right? And then again, if you take the basic premise that we're not free until we're all free, right? And then even go back to the Combahee River Collective, right? That when Black women are free, then we'll all be free, right? So part of that means taking very seriously, what does gender mean for Black men or Black masculinity? And how does that undermine supposed commitments to freedom and liberation, right? And then in addition to that, what will we have to give up in order to get that liberation we supposedly want and desire, right? And so, kind of at the basis of this too was, think about quilombos, I talked about it a little bit earlier. It was about finding relationships that were not permissible under Brazilian colonialism and slavery. Thinking about this in the contemporary moment, how do Black people of all genders and sexualities and different backgrounds have to find different ways to connect that uproot not just anti-Blackness and white supremacy, but also the heteropatriarchy and heteronormativity, right? I always get a lot of folks talk to me about the chapter on Black masculinity, right? Intimacy, right? Which ways can we valorize, and part of that is saying, patriarchy is also detrimental to Black men, to men in general, right? And of course, I'm getting this from Bell Hooks. I identified two rappers. Also, actually, to the earlier question, two other people that people should know are Eschubaco do Blues and Vandal de Verdade. But they both each have a song that I analyzed in I believe it was the fourth chapter, right? Of identifying the pitfalls of a Black masculinity that's embedded in hip hop and the African diaspora, right? The one that circulates so predominantly, right? That it actually, the things they actually want, which is social connection and bonds, is actually the very thing being taken away from them in pursuit of kind of this heteropatriarchal power. In contrast, right, I then turn to more the ethnographic work of finding the ways that Black men relate to one, and often in ways it's very much autoethnographic in that chapter as well, right? Don't realize we're creating systems of care and intimacy and trust, right, that requires us to be vulnerable with one another in pursuit of a collective safety, right? And so I talk about how, doing field work, and this is also pre-Uber era, being in some of the periphery neighborhoods at night and having to go to the bus stop. All the Black men were like, I'm walking to the bus stop. And I'm, after the first couple of times, I'm like, okay, cool. And after I'm like, I could walk myself to the bus stop. I don't need you, right? And even my own kind of fragile masculinity coming out. And they're like, no. I can't, I won't feel right knowing that you don't get home safe, right? And for me, that was always very powerful, impactful, and very caring and thoughtful, right? Because I think we're not used to that in Brazil and also United States, right? And so, it's very much a form of care, to be worried about another Black man's safety, right? And not doing this kind of very hyper individualistic, overly aggressive, physical, right? And so really in that chapter, I was really trying to consider, valorizing Black men for ways beyond cultural expressions, right? Whether that's sports or music or, art, but also in ways that aren't about aggression or violence.
Quantos anos faltam pra eu ser revelação do ano? Já são 10 de estrada e eu ainda tô sem casa, mano. Se eu fosse branca, certeza seria fácil. Não colo com otário, você sabe que eu não passo pano. Eu vivo a música e isso não é fácil. Contas chegam todo mês, preciso ser ágil. Todo dia penso em largar e não é fácil. Como faço isso se sou a mais no que faço? Véi, ninguém me obrigou, mas me foi designado, tá ligado? Eu nasci pra isso. E essa é a única coisa que eu tenho certeza que eu faço certo. Então, eu sou feliz fazendo e é pra lá que vai. Ninguém paga as minhas contas, ninguém vê o meu choro. Ninguém segurou a minha mão no fundo do poço. Se afastar é fácil, melhor juntar de novo. O mal do esperto é achar que todo mundo é bobo. Quero o melhor pra minha família. Geladeira cheia e uma casa com piscina. Manhã ir ao médico sem precisar enfrentar fila. Isso é coisa mínima, sem demagogia. Tudo que eu escrevo é um pedaço da minha vida. Embora eu pago o preço por não ter te ouvido, tia. Tudo que eu faço é por amor e vício. Quero o retorno. Olha o que você fez comigo.
I really appreciate that part of your writing a lot. Actually, is really stuck with me. Your descriptions of being at the clubs, meeting hip hop artists and other artists, and just kind of being in the scene and relating to people in the scene, and how it reflected on your own ideas about community and other things. I thought it was really, really amazing.
Thank you. So yeah, something I didn't want to do the thing what a lot of people do is like, well, if I'm gonna talk about Black feminism, I'm only gonna talk about Black women, right? Because only they have gender, right? On the other side, I also wanted to think about the different ways we could valorize Black women beyond kind of a subordinate position to Black men, right? And this is, I talked mostly in final chapter, Ordinary Women, or Real Women, excuse me, right? Where I look at Black feminist graffiti artists' depictions of Yemenja, the Afro-Brazilian deity or Orisha, of beauty and motherhood, and how these artists depict her as what they say ordinary women. So they're chubby, they're older, right? And so and I remember asking one graffiti artist, she's like, well, I just wanted to depict Yemenja as the ordinary women or the real women I see in my everyday life, right? So she's talking about her neighbors, her aunties, her cousins, partners, etc. And to valorize them, because so often, right, even to go back to that trope of the hypersexual mulatto that's valorized in the Gilberto Freire mythos, right? And I believe Lelia Gonzalez about it's like, she's also the domestic worker, right? She also grows older. She's not always going to be in that position forever, right? And so, certain Black women might be able to step into that subjectivity, but it's not always forever, right? And so how do we keep valorizing Black women, not just because they're hypersexualized and they're attractive in a certain way, but how do we valorize them for being, how do we elevate them to a divine status that goes beyond that, right? And the other part I'll add to that too is, Black feminist notions of justice. And I talk about this in the sixth chapter of this one group, Visionarias, where these Black women talk about how a Black man had harmed a Black woman. And instead of turning to the state or letting it slide, and also a side note, Brazil just has ridiculous rates of femicide, which overwhelmingly affects Black women. And so this is a huge issue, particularly around domestic violence, but also gendered violence. How do we find a form of justice outside of the state, which is extremely punitive towards Black people and is anti-Black, right? And so part of that, they turn to the Orishas to pursue justice outside of the legal system, right? But to find, not to, even though this man has caused harm, not to put him in further harm by exposing him to the terrorism of the state. And so, throughout the whole book, I was trying to find different ways to, and also I was trained by some really dope Black feminists, and I knew if I didn't do a good job, they would like bonk me over the heads, so I was like, all right, I listened and I did well.
So kind of changing directions a little bit, although it's not a central theme in the book, you say that Black people are using various technological apparatuses and digital platforms to produce quilombismo and aquilombamento. Can you tell us a bit more about this or elaborate on this point?
Yeah, I think part of it is, I was thinking about the continuity of the quilombo, and so much of it historically has been, embodied expressions, right, and oral traditions. And, as someone who's also trained in media studies, right, and trying to upend the way that Black or African-derived cultural expressions are always seen as anti-technological, I wanted to think about the ways that Black people are using technology to create quilombos, right? And so part of that is, Black people making music using computers, right? So I spend a lot of time at people's studios, right? Which a lot of them also double as people's apartments, And so the way that, people are using computers and software as instruments, right? And again, this is one of the key interventions of hip hop was it used technology as an instrument, right? And also part of that too was creating, and I'm also very hesitant to, I think it's a key component. I'm always kind of wary of people who think it's like the primary component, but online communities as well, right? Online spaces, whether that's been Facebook, Instagram, Twitter /X, or Coochie, if anybody remembers, or Cut. That's a throwback for some folks, right? But using these as digital spaces where people can come together, but also to mobilize in person as well, right? And again, and part of that too was disrupting the way that people often think about and imagine and interact with Salvador as a city of pre-modern African culturalisms, right? Ignoring the way that people are using technology here, media technology, right? And so, with that, it was really just acknowledging, I think it was another way for me to demonstrate how people in the hip hop movement are also modern actors, right? That they're not just, clinging on to pre-modern forms of cultural expression and transmission. And they are too, right? But it's also intertwined with technology, and that doesn't undermine what they're doing.
Meu papai, te amo.
pode tá na caça do milhão. Eu não vivo de freestyle, mas rimo de coração. Eu sou rival da emoção, faço das tripas coração. Ser humano falho, cheio de contradição. Cheio de contradição, eu quero mais do que pão. Meu Deus nos dá hoje, mas me dá mais do que pão. Me desculpa, Deus, fã, peço seu perdão. Olha pro seu filho, cê perdoa, mas eu não. Vandal dispensa introdução na cena sem meus problemas, eu já tô cheio de problema. Eu amo meus parceiros, esse é o meu problema. Odeio os inimigos, esse é meu dilema. Fuck the police, beat sem problema. Relógio em cada pulso, beat tipo algema. Vem que vem com calma, cada grama queima. Minha vida é puta pra viver.
Yeah, in your coda conclusion of the book, you say a lot of things that are actually I've felt very moving and also kind of disrupted in a way, kind of challenging the reader to understand your position as a human being, not only as a writer. And I want to read a little part of it, if you don't mind. And yeah, you're right. One reason why I love poor and working class Black people is their radical love of the popular and their innovative uses of the profane, the grotesque, the kitsch, the copy, and the artificial. Dismiss it at your own peril. It beautifully scripts against beloved notions of the pure, the bourgeois, the original, the avant-garde, the respectable, the highbrow, and the normative. And by doing this, we often radically love the people who are not meant to be loved, valorized, and adored. It's a whole different way of building social systems, and ultimately what it means to be human. You want to comment on that and tell us more about this coda?
Yeah, I actually wrote the coda as kind of a relief. Well, and I think I wrote it, it wasn't supposed to be in the book. And I wrote it as a way to remind myself of why I'm writing this book. And, I started this project in 2012, in grad school. A lot has happened since then, right? And, I got done with the book and I didn't really know how to wrap it up. And I kept looking, and it wasn't even called a coda. I just, it was probably saved as like the first 5 words of the coda. But I really feel like it was important to describe that and to get the reader to think about the personal stakes of this work, right? That, we can do this academic study of quilombos and quilombomento and urban Black communities, but I want people to think about this is really central to our political liberation. And for people to think about what's at stake. And, part of the backdrop too was I've seen and studied a lot of movements that have floundered because so often they replicate hierarchies that they're trying to get away from, right? Also, I've seen a lot of amazing artists, activists, community organizers who burned out by resisting, the proverbial system, right? Which was a very real, it's a very material thing. And so part of that was thinking, getting us to think about what is it, when we're done resisting, what do we want to build? And what do we need to build that? And how can we start practicing, rehearsing, creating a choreography for when that moment might come, right? And I think for me, it was very much an affirmation of Black life and of a Black future, which, and again, within a Black rap, is also considering a collective liberation. And I wanted that to be grounded in love, right? So often we're tired, we're angry, and of course, as Audre Lorde tells us, anger has a place, rage has a place. We have a right to be angry, but also, and that's part of the full range of human emotions. But also wanted to think about what would it mean to build with love, and not in kind of this bell hooks notion of love, right? That's not just about romantic love, but finding our most important relationship not in romance, but in community. And and maybe it was just like my last chance to like knock the reader over the head. Like, this is what this is about. Don't forget it. I've had a few people tell me like, oh, I read that, and I had to read the book all over again. And it gave me an entirely different perspective on the book. Like, I loved it when I read the first time in the code. I was like, oh, this is what he's getting at, right? So maybe it was also a cheat code to have people read it twice as well.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but thank you so much for tuning in. Emergent Quilombos, Black Life and Hip Hop in Brazil is available for purchase at utpress.utexas.edu. Check the show notes for links to where you can order a copy, as well as a link to a Spotify playlist that Bryce made of various Afro-Brazilian artists. To stay up to date on new issues, articles, and podcast episodes from Latin American perspectives, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or your preferred listening app. If you're a student, academic, or activist interested in Latin America, or simply someone who wants to engage with the most in-depth and well-researched scholarship on Latin American politics, political economy, society, and culture, please consider subscribing to the journal. Annual print subscriptions start at $74, and we offer discounted rates for students and members of the Latin American Studies Association. In a moment marked by the rise of U.S. imperialism, right-wing authoritarianism, the erosion of independent publishing, and the broader decline of print and academic media, supporting journals like Latin American Perspectives is more important than ever. Your subscription helps sustain a critical space for internationalist, anti-capitalist, and decolonial scholarship. Hasta la próxima. Gracias.